Hello and welcome back to another video exploration of the book of Romans. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week, kind of going along with a Bible study that's going on within my congregation. And I present these just as a companion to kind of give an overview of what we had discussed in our group setting, so that those who were unable to make it to that can kind of keep up on what we talked about. So this particular week we talked about the third chapter of Romans, which picks up very much so in the same line where chapter 2 had led off. At the end of chapter 2, kind of what we talked about last time, which was 2 weeks ago, the Paul was trying to make a distinction between Jew and Greek, or let me actually rephrase that. Paul was breaking down the distinction between Jew and Greek, or Jew and Gentile, saying that within the realm of the world as it has been changed through the event of Jesus Christ, those cultural distinctions are kind of irrelevant now. That seems to be the major argument that Paul makes. And that's kind of the high end argument. Some of the things that we hear now in chapter 3 sort of raise an eyebrow towards that, which we discussed a little bit last night. One of the other big themes that came up that's very, very present in chapter 3, Romans in general, but here in chapter 3, is the idea of justification or righteousness. Also, like redemption is in there a little bit, and that's kind of different. But the idea of justification, or being declared righteous, or being justified. They actually come from the same Greek word. To dikaiosune is the word, and it kind of is an indication of being called just, or being called righteous. And that's the main idea that I want to get across, is that our righteousness, or our justification, or being justified, or however you want to word it in the English, is not something that is self-generated. And that's been an ongoing theme now throughout these first 3 chapters, is that it's not something that we do, that the closest we can attempt to come is through the law. Of course, the law being given to the Jewish nation way, way, way back when, with Moses. But that the law, we can never complete the law. We can never uphold the law. We can never fulfill the law. And therefore, trying to achieve justification, or trying to be justified by what we do or by what we do not do, can never happen. We just can't do it. We are unable to. And therefore, the law serves to condemn, or the law, I've heard it said, and actually this phrase kind of came up in our discussion last night: the law kills, the gospel sets free. That the law points out our sinfulness, and then the good news of the gospel frees us from its condemnation. And that was a lot of what we talked about. We really, within our discussion last night, I don't want to use the phrase "we got stuck," but that was kind of a pretty major discussion. The interesting thing about Paul, he was a brilliant guy, seemingly. Of course, he lived 2,000 years ago, so it's hard to say for sure. But based on his writings, he seemed to be a really brilliant person. And the way he writes, particularly here in Romans, seems very, very intellectual, for lack of a better word. It's very much coming across, especially this chapter, and especially the first part of this chapter, as almost like a very high-end theological paper, and therefore it can be difficult to kind of wrap our heads around and understand. And so we remained in that conversation for quite a while. What is Paul trying to say here, and why does he make the individual statements that he makes? And we needed to remind ourselves after a while that this is just one portion of a larger argument. And even though some parts seem troublesome, or some parts, based on translation situations between different English translations, read kind of difficult, that we need to remember the overarching argument. And And the long story short, kind of coming back around to what I had said before, that that righteousness or justification or being justified is something that is bestowed upon us. It's not something that we accomplish, and that is why Christ needed to come. And that, in my head anyway, seems to be Paul's big argument, that the law serves a purpose and that the law is important, but the law does not create righteousness, or does not enable righteousness, but rather the law serves to point out our lack of it, if that makes sense. Again, I'm kind of almost talking myself into a corner as I think about this. But a takeaway is that this chapter in particular, and especially like the first 20 verses of it, it's very heady. It's very almost confusing, and difficult to perhaps wrap our heads around. But the chapter itself, chapter 3, is kind of broken up. We broke it up into 3 different sections that we talked about. First off is verses 1 through 8. And that's kind of the basis for that. And also then 9 through 20 is the next section. And we see this. We see Paul is really hammering on the human condition, and how we believe we trust that we can't trust ourselves, if that makes any sense whatsoever. But that the law, which was given to the Jewish people and is now spreading throughout the world, is however we want to look at that, seeks to point out our shortcomings. And is that God's intention of, I want to tell you how bad you are? I don't think so. But I think that seems to be now that Christ has come, now that Christ has redeemed the world, and asks of us faith, that we believe the promises made by God through the life, death, resurrection of Christ, that we see the law in a new light. The law was intended to be a gift to the Jewish people. So this is how you live in relationship with God and in relationship with one another, and our human nature messes that up. That's really the ongoing takeaway, as we think about the gospel, and that's a very Lutheran understanding. I'll admit that my theological understandings are shaped by Lutheran understandings, and so that's kind of how I look at that. But then the final section of this chapter, verses 21 through 31, kind of we start to see a little shift, and we've seen this in Paul's writings before, that rhetorically he sets up an argument, and then he switches gears, and comes at it from a different direction, and that very much seems to be the case that we see here, beginning in verse 21. We've heard law. And what does the law do, and how do we uphold the law? And do we uphold the law? And no, we don't. And therefore, our injustice points towards God's justice, and on and on and on and on. But now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed and is attested by the law and the prophets, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. They are now justified by his grace as gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. The rest of the chapter is very much pointing in that direction. Now we see for Paul the emphasis on faith, that it is not what we do, it is not what we say, it is not what we think, that our justification is not about making the right animal sacrifices to atone for the sins that we commit, that we do not perfect ourselves by following the law, that it doesn't work that way, but that we are named justified, we are seen by God as justified, or called righteous, whichever word you want to use, because of our faith in Christ. And that's it. It's believing those promises. That's what faith is. I mentioned, I think in the last video for chapter 2, that eventually Paul will get to talking about Abraham, how God spoke to Abraham and made promises, and Abraham believed what God said, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Abraham is in my head called the father of faith, because of that, because we see that righteousness is believing what God has said to you, even against all odds, believing that which we cannot prove, that which we cannot see, but that God has promised, and we believe it. That's what faith is. And I actually had this conversation with some of my confirmation students this week of what is faith? How can we believe, or how can we know that God is real and that these things are true? And faith is believing in something that you cannot see, and yet trusting that it is true and that it is real without proof, because we cannot prove this stuff. I wish we could. It would make my job a whole lot easier, but we can't. But we believe these promises that are made to us or on our behalf through the life and death of Jesus. That was a lot of what we talked about last night. Again, we really did admittedly get pretty bogged down in some of the harder, headier stuff in the first part of the chapter, because I think it's so much in our nature to want to be justified, to want to know I'm okay, I've done what I need to do, I'm on the right side of the line, and because of that, we get so caught in it. And interestingly enough, as I'm saying that, it occurs to me that's probably why Paul gave it so much emphasis, is because that is human nature. I want to know that I'm okay, but there is no checklist that we can do to prove that to ourselves. It's all about our faith in Christ. So that's kind of what we see here in chapter 3, and that we see the importance of Christ, why Christ was a requirement, why humanity must rely on Christ, and I ended up talking about this real briefly, and I've said this before in some of my different videos, maybe not here for Romans, but some of the other videos that I've made, that the gospel can be broken down into 4 chapters. Like if you're doing an elevator pitch and you've got like 2 floors to tell somebody about it, God made it, humanity messed it up, Christ redeemed it, and now we, through Christ, we are invited into the work of reconciling the world back to God, and Christ redeemed it, that it is finished. It is done, even if it doesn't feel like it. Those promises are for us. They are real. They are for you. And we take them with faith. We believe the promises of God, and it's credited as righteousness. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means, share those down in the comment section. Again, chapter 3 is some hard stuff. Romans as a whole, it's got some hard stuff in it, but that's okay. And we muddle through it together, and we learn together, and we trust that the Spirit reveals things as the Spirit needs to. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week, and God bless you, and we will catch you next time.